One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey, good morning, everybody. It's Dr. Steve Noseworthy back again with another mini-series in the Inflammation Nation podcast. We're going to spend some time talking about detoxification and dispelling some of the myths and misconceptions about what detox is and how it's done properly. And I'll come back to that in just a little bit. But I wanted to say, again, another thank you. We continue to hit milestones in how rapidly the podcast is growing. And if you've been listening for a while, several episodes ago, I mentioned that we had hit, or we're closing in on 10,000 downloads, which I think is a pretty fast growth rate since we started the podcast just back in January, at the beginning of January. And we just recently passed 12,000, and we're just growing every day. And new people all around the world are tuning into the Inflammation Nation podcast, which I think probably belies an underlying issue with healthcare. And so before we get into the detox, I want to talk about something that I call autonomous health. And the word autonomous, sometimes it's a little bit of a mouthful, but it basically means independence. And autonomous health is about becoming relatively independent of the conventional medical system. And I say relatively independent just simply because the modern conventional healthcare system, what's technically called allopathic medicine, as opposed to, say, naturopathic or chiropractic or any other form of medicine, it has its uses. And certainly I'm not a medical doctor. That actually didn't interest me at all when I went into the field of chiropractic, and maybe someday I'll tell the story about how I became a chiropractor and what I was doing before and how my career has transitioned over the decades. But nevertheless, allopathic medicine excels, pardon me, and really shines in certain contexts. And that would be things like emergency medicine or caring for people who have established long-term disease processes. And, I myself have availed myself of allopathic medicine many times throughout the course of my life, mostly for orthopedic issues. Just to tell you a little bit about my story, I actually have had both of my hips replaced, and I had that done when I was, how old was I? I was 55 years old. And certainly I was athletic in my youth and played my fair share of explosive jumping sports. I was a basketball player, a volleyball player at the national caliber level, and also did, a little bit of track and field and all that kind of stuff when I was younger. But nevertheless, none of those things are sufficient to break down someone's joints to the point where they need joint replacement at the age of 55. And it turns out that I had some anatomical anomalies that are not all that uncommon, but where the shape of what's called my femoral head, where the leg bone sits up into the pelvis, was slightly irregular. And that irregularity, rather than being kind of like a rounded, smooth surface, was enough to wear down my cartilage faster on top of, all the sports that I played over the years. And it's the most common reason why someone my age would need to have a hip replacement, when normally you wouldn't expect to see that until someone's well into their 70s, perhaps even in their 80s. But nevertheless, that's a whole different conversation and story. But my point is that I have no problem with conventional medicine. That's not true. I have a lot of problems with conventional medicine, but I have no problem with conventional medicine when it does what it's really good at. And, one of the issues, getting back to this idea of autonomous health, is that there's typically a huge mismatch between what the average healthcare consumer is looking for and what the conventional system provides. And just to boil it down to simplicity and truth, that the conventional healthcare system is focused on identifying and managing disease processes with drugs and surgery. I mean, that's it. That's how medical doctors are trained. And thank God they are trained that way. And thank God most of them are very good at what they do, simply because there are times when surgery is necessary. There are times when medication is necessary. But the flip side of that is that there are so many health issues and challenges that people, perhaps like you, suffer, that really have nothing to do with the disease process per se. And all of these are rooted in some way, at some level, in an inflammatory process. And all of these underlying mechanisms, which may or may not have some kind of a disease process involved, whether that's autoimmunity or something else that's, say, diagnosable, but all of these things that have some kind of an inflammatory response associated with them, there is some degree of impact of things like diet and lifestyle and environmental exposure on how inflamed your body is, and how that changes how all your major systems operate. And we just went through and finished off a relatively long series on inflammation and hormones and how that impacts health. And if you've not listened to that, you might want to go back, even if you don't have hormonal issues and complaints at this point in your life. If you are part of the inflammation nation and you're kind of in this kind of no man's land where you're suffering with symptoms and changes in your quality of life, and conventional medicine has not given you the answers or the results or the hope that you're looking for, then you need to educate yourself as best as you can about all aspects of health and wellness. And that necessitates understanding inflammation, and perhaps at a level that your doctors don't. And one of the things that I've found, and I've been in the natural medicine business since 1995, so that puts me over a quarter of a decade at this point. And what I've noticed, one of the things I've noticed over the last couple of decades, is that the people that I work with are increasingly more discerning and educated about health and wellness. The average client who contacts me to have me put together a personalized wellness program, if you want to call it that, is they just know a lot more than the clients I worked with 10, 15 years ago. And that's obviously due to the internet and the accessibility of information. But there is a flip side to that, which is there's a lot of bad information out there. And in this mini series on detox, I'm going to try to dispel all of that and, talk about what we might call the new science of detoxification. But we have some groundwork to lay first. And so back to this idea of autonomous health, it's about being relatively independent of the conventional system. It's there to be used when it's appropriate. I believe that there's always the right tool for the right job at the right time, and sometimes that does involve allopathic medicine. But part of the problem with allopathic medicine is that because the average conventional medical doctor is not trained to talk to you about diet or lifestyle or exercise or environmental exposure and toxins, they're basically there to refer you to specialists or to give you basic medications, and obviously refer you to surgery if that's something that needs to be done. But they're not going to guide you in anything other than that, unless you have someone who is thinking outside the box, and unfortunate to say, is risking the ire and the disapproval of their colleagues. And here's just an aside story. As I'm recording this right now, my wife Kathy and I were up in Eastern Canada visiting my dad. Not to turn this into a personal story, but we lost my mom. Actually, both of us lost our mothers in 2020, right before the whole pandemic craziness started. And we lost them 6 months apart, 6 weeks apart. And my mother-in-law gave in to pancreatic cancer after fighting for a year and a half. And this was down in Florida, which is where we're based, technically based. And my mom, 6 weeks later, passed in St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada, where I'm from, 6 weeks later. And so I made a promise when I came up for her funeral. I made a promise to my dad that I'd come back and spend several months out of every year up here. And so we pack up our RV once a year, and we travel up here and park and hang out with the family and be with my dad for as much time as I can manage. And then we head back to the States and back to our base in Florida, and usually spend a lot of time traveling around seeing our kids. And, the really cool thing about where we are today in healthcare with the internet, I've had an entirely virtual or online wellness clinic, if you will, or practice for well over 10 years, far before everybody started using Zoom. Myself and a handful of other docs have been doing this for quite a long time. And I'm getting off on a little bunny trail, as I tend to do, but it's just a little bit of insight into where we are. But the whole point of bringing that up was that last year my dad had some health issues, and I was going with him to doctor's appointments and all those different things, and we were talking to his endocrinologist. And my dad's 84 years old at this point, and of course you would expect most men at that age to have low hormonal status, and he certainly was in his dealing with the impacts of low testosterone in the sense of cardiovascular risk and loss of muscle mass and just a loss of sense of youthful vigor, for example. And I brought up the issue of putting him on testosterone replacement, not to try to reclaim his hormonal levels back when he was 20 years old. I don't think that would serve him right now at 84, but nevertheless, when I brought it up, and I think I had some very valid points in terms of things like protecting heart and brain and restoring some of his muscle mass and his strength and his physical capacity. And she refused to even have a conversation. And when I asked her why, she said, because I would come under fire from my peers, is what she said. And so even though I knew that she knew it was probably a good idea for him, she couldn't do it because the system is geared so that when any doctor steps outside the boundaries and kind of colors outside the lines, it brings the attention of others. And sometimes medical doctors can be brought up under review by their boards because somebody else has narked on them and said, hey, this person's doing something that we as a group don't approve of. And they can come under disciplinary action. And I know this for sure because I've been the clinical director of multidisciplinary clinics where we had medical doctors and nurse practitioners on staff. And so I kind of know a little bit more about how that system works. And, it's not as nice and neat on the inside as it might seem to be on the outside. But nevertheless, back to the core issue, and I guess I'm rambling because I feel guilty because I didn't put out an episode this past Thursday. I'm actually an episode behind. So we're going to go a little bit longer today, and we'll try to cover the content of 2 different episodes just in this one. But I did want to talk about these big picture ideas. And so back to autonomous health, it's very important for you to know enough about your body and about health and wellness and things like inflammation and all the other things that inflammation touches, and to know what is under your control to do for yourself, because you're probably not going to get it in conventional medicine. Now, can you go into the world of alternative medicine and seek those things out? Yes, and there's a lot of very well educated, very well credentialed, very well qualified people in all of the what medical doctors called, say, the allied health disciplines, whether that is chiropractors or acupuncturists that have taken time to step outside of their basic training and to learn about things like functional medicine. And, over the last 13, 14 years or so that I've been teaching functional medicine seminars across the country, I have conventionally trained docs and I have the whole spectrum of alternatively trained docs in pretty much every group that I've taught in the last 10 to 15 years. And there's some really sharp people out there, but I will tell you that there's some really, really not sharp. I don't want to say dumb, but there's a lot of docs out there that say they do natural medicine or functional medicine, and they just really don't know what they're doing. And again, I don't think it's a matter of intelligence. I think it's a matter of perspective and thought process. And so you end up with doctors who are, they do very basic and fundamental things, or they skip steps and they do, all the sexy and new things without making sure that somebody's fundamental physiology has been shored up. But nevertheless, here's the bottom line. 80% of what you can do to be healthier is under your control. And that concept is what the idea of autonomous health is built on. Start learning and start taking control of your own health. And if you can't figure everything out, then, there's people like me and others like me that are here to help you bridge the gap. Or if you just feel at the beginning that things are too complicated for you, that's why I'm here. But it's also why I started the whole Inflammation Nation podcast, is to start educating people about what they can do for themselves so they're not entirely reliant on conventional medicine, and that they're hearing something other than the answer is drugs and surgery. Sometimes the answer is drugs and surgery, but many times it's not. So let me just kind of give you a big picture idea of what the whole detox, like this new science of detoxification, is all about. Because there's a big problem in the information world of the internet, and the other place you'll see these things is you'll see it in the grocery store. All the magazines that tout these 3-day juice cleanses or detox for 2 weeks and lose 30 pounds and all this just kind of nonsense. But when we look at the body of literature on detoxification, which is detoxification or detox is the word that I'm going to use throughout this series, just because it's the word that most of us use. But the technical word is really biotransformation. And I'll define this a little bit later, but that's the word typically that you'll see in the medical literature. But when we look at the body of literature on detox, I think it becomes pretty apparent very easily that, number one, detoxification is an ongoing process. You should never really think of detox as an event, like I'm going to do a detox, because you're detoxing all the time. The question is how effective and how efficient is your natural detox process? And the other side of that equation is, what is your environmental exposure? Do you have a chemical burden? The answer is yes, you do. We all do. But there's also what I would consider to be a scale and a spectrum on which we are all at a different point, that ranges from someone who just has a toxin load that they can handle well and are not symptomatic and it's not really promoting any health issues, all the way to the extreme of someone has an environmentally induced autoimmunity, and they have some kind of chemical exposure that is modifying cellular responses, derailing major systems like hormonal systems, or thyroid obviously is a hormone, changing things like metabolic control, and on top of that has the potential to cause damage to your cell membrane, to change again how your cells function, and also potential to have an impact at the level of DNA. And this is a real deal. And so the last thing I want you to think is that, especially if you're listening to podcasts like this, because you do have some significant health challenges, please don't think that you can drink lemon juice water or do a juice cleanse for 2 or 3 days or even a couple of weeks and really have some long-term significant impact on whatever is going on with your body. It just doesn't work that way. You might have a short-term impact for sure, but I'll tell you that if somebody does a short-term detox, whether it's a liver cleanse, taking herbs like milk thistle or dandelion or whatever the case is, or supporting their kidneys and doing saunas, and if that makes a huge difference to their health and well-being, they really didn't have a big problem to begin with, because the process of detoxification, as I said, is an ongoing thing. And with the people that I work with individually, when we define what their toxin load is, and we figure out whether or not their immune system is involved in everything that's going on with their environmental burden, it can take 6 months to a year to get them to the point where their toxin burden is down to what we consider reasonable or safe levels, and to unwind all of the metabolic issues that come out of being toxic. And I'm saying that just as a generic thing. So what I do when I work with somebody who clearly has a problem with their toxin burden and toxin handling is I break the whole process down into 3 different steps that I call 3D detox. And that's just the fact that each of these steps begins with the letter D. And the first one is deload. And that basically is what I also call a pre-tox. These are the things that you need to do before you start to do a detox. And I think that the more health challenges that you have, the more complicated your scenarios, the more inflamed you are, the more likely it is that detox is not the best first thing that you should do. And that brings up another issue, is that it's very common in the world of natural medicine for docs to say, well, I detox everybody out of the gate. And that's great. That's fine. They could probably use it to a certain degree. but these tend to be canned processes, kind of a one size fits all, or a little program that somebody puts everybody through. And that's going to help some people, but again, it's going to be on the more conservative end of the scale where things are not all that complicated. And there's not a lot of things at stake, for example. But nevertheless, and I'll explain later why it's important to not always think of detox first and foremost. There are some steps that people need to take before they start detox, and we call that deloading or pre-tox. Then there's the detox process itself, and I run the risk of contradicting myself because I do tell someone, hey, we're going to do a detox at this point in your program. But I'm very well aware that I just said that detox is not an event. It's an ongoing process. But the detox is really about how to effectively and safely neutralize and eliminate both what are called xenobiotics and toxicants. And very quickly, a xenobiotic is something for which there is a liver-based phase 1, phase 2 process to transform it from a fat-loving molecule or fat-soluble molecule into a water-soluble molecule so we can eliminate it. So xenobiotics basically go through the liver, to say it more simply. And this other class of toxins called toxicants, which are not handled by the liver and are handled by more kind of a natural chelation process, most notably driven by glutathione. And these would be certain chemicals, but things like heavy metals. Like you can't support your liver to get rid of mercury. It just does not work that way. And so that's the detox phase. So the first D is deload, and then the second D is detox. And then the final D in the 3D detox paradigm is called deep tox. And that's how to access toxins that are stored deeply in your body and how to repair the damage done to your cells by having a chemical burden. And, the interesting thing is that if you look at somebody, kind of through a conceptual lens, they have toxins that are in 2, perhaps 3 different places. One is just in circulation. If you today just peed in a cup and sent a sample to a lab and had them measure heavy metals and, say, mycotoxins and then environmental chemicals, that would be just what's immediately in circulation. That doesn't tell you anything about what is stored deep in your tissues, because most toxins are actually stored in your fat cells or other organ systems that have kind of like a fatty component to it. For example, bone marrow, even your brain tissue. There's a lot of phospholipid content there, and this is where chemicals and toxins like to hang out. They like to hang out in fat cells and fatty type tissues. And so we have chemicals that are in circulation, we have things that are stored deep in your tissues, and then there's what we call the extracellular space, which is the kind of the space in between your bloodstream and being inside your cell itself. And so this is where toxins live. And the last thing that most of us want to do is just get really aggressive with the detox and start pulling things out of storage immediately without taking steps first to make sure that your body can handle that. And that's really what the concept of deload and detox and putting that in front of the deep tox is all about. So this kind of a general overview, and we'll come back to these concepts as we continue to go through. Let's talk about like how polluted are we? This is kind of very concerning, or at least it should be. If you look at, and this is data that's very easily found just through a simple Google search, but when we look at worldwide chemical production, the U.S. ranks 84th. Certainly there are other countries, and despite all the talk about climate and environment that we see in industrialized countries, U.S. is ranked 84th in terms of the level of pollution. Now that's still a lot, and it still presents a major challenge, but we're not number 1, we're not number 10, we're not number 20, we're number 84. United Kingdom is 92nd, and Canada, my home country, is 97th. Again, I'm not saying it's not an issue. I'm just saying, given how bad things could be, especially compared to some of the other industrialized countries, we have a relatively clean environment, but it doesn't mean it's perfect, and it doesn't mean it's great, and it doesn't mean that it's not having an impact on people. For example, in the European Union, they produce approximately, and these numbers change just a little bit every year, but they produce about 230 million tons of chemicals every year. And in the US, and this number is as of 2021, in the US, we produce 946 million tons of chemicals every year. And currently, there are about 80,000 man-made chemicals that are known to exist in the US. And in the US, we produce, as do other countries, we produce thousands of new chemicals each year. And part of the problem is that this industry is governed by what are called post-market laws, which means that countries don't have to prove that chemicals are safe before they put them in the environment. The system is set up so that once an chemical is introduced into the environment, it takes a whole bunch of people having really serious problems before anybody cares and might take steps to limit their exposure or even, ban the production of these things, as was done, for example, with the chemical DDT that was used back in the 60s and early 70s to control mosquito populations before everyone realized, hey, this is not good, and they banned its use in, I think it was 1972. And also, when you look at kind of this whole safety issue and how many chemicals we're producing, the safety testing system does not match the production rate, meaning that we're producing more chemicals every year than the EPA can keep up with. And what that means is that year after year after year, we have more of a complicated problem when it comes to, environmental chemicals and ultimately the impact that has on human health and well-being. And, sad to say, but, when we look at, the projected rate of growth of chemicals all the way out to 2050, we're projected to have 4.5 or 450% more chemicals in the environment in 2050 than we did back in 2000. And that's significant. According to the Environmental Work Group, which is a fairly well-known kind of watchdog organization that watches what the EPA does and what industry is doing, they say that women use an average of 12 personal care products per day. And in those 12 personal care products, and we're talking about soaps and shampoos and lotions and cosmetics and all this kind of stuff, in those 12 personal care products, there are 168 different chemicals. That's crazy. Every single day, the average woman in North America is putting 168 different chemicals on or in her body in some way that can get absorbed and brought into their physiology. Now, men use fewer products, but they still put on average about 85 chemicals on their body. Teens use an average of 17 personal care products, which include 16 known hormone-altering or endocrine-disrupting chemicals, which is, it's a bad deal for everyone, but when you're going through puberty, that's, kind of magnified. And here's the scariest part of this. And the EPA they did this study. I can't remember what the year was, but it's been a while because I remember I've referenced this in seminars where I've taught on environmental toxicity to docs before. But there was a study done X number of years ago where they took several hundred women who were pregnant and they followed them. And when the babies were born, they took samples of the umbilical cord blood of their babies. And every single baby had, on average, I think the exact number was 287 chemicals actually in their blood. And so literally we're in a place right now where babies are being born with a toxic burden. You don't have to be born first and then exposed to the environment over years to become toxic. Babies are being born with almost 300 chemicals in their umbilical cord blood. And this leads me to, kind of one of the core concepts in understanding the whole issue and the whole problem with environmental toxicity is that exposure to toxins in today's day and age is an inescapable fact of life. And it's not a matter of if you have a toxic load. The question is, how bad is it? How much of this stuff do you have? And how is your body responding to that? Because quite clearly, you can have two people who live in the same house, work in the same job, the same office building, eat the same diet, breathe the same air, drink the same water, and they will have two different toxic loads, even though we're all exposed to the same things. And this is, again, let me just say it again, exposure to toxic chemicals is an inescapable fact of life. There's no such thing as being toxin free. And this is why when we do clinical laboratory testing to define someone's chemical load, there's always a normal range. The normal ranges are not zero, unfortunately. The normal ranges are based on this concept of below a certain threshold, we think that these chemicals are not going to cause a problem. And that's not entirely true, as I will explain a little bit probably on a different episode. And so just to kind of give you a little bit of insight here, there are two things that are at stake when it comes to your toxic burden. And one is quantitative, the other is qualitative. And the quantitative aspect of that is how much do you have? And certainly more of a toxic chemical tends to cause more of a problem. But the other qualitative aspect is whether or not your immune system is involved in reacting to the chemical itself. And that's a little bit of a misdirection. It's not really the chemical itself, because your immune system can only react to things that have protein structures to them. And so if your immune system is reacting to your chemical burden, it's because those chemicals are binding to your own cells, which has a protein structure. And now your immune system can recognize that, and it can react to the combination of some kind of a toxin plus your own tissue. And that represents, let's say, the most extreme form of environmental toxicity, which is where you actually, the chemical load is driving autoimmunity. Because when you have an antibody, when your immune system creates an antibody to the complex of a toxin plus your own cells, it makes it to the U part of that. It makes it to the protein structure of the cell in your body that the chemical is bound to. It doesn't react to the chemical itself, but the complex of the two linked together. And that's very important to realize. It's not a question of do you have a chemical burden? You do, but how bad is it quantitatively, and what's going on qualitatively with your immune response and your immune system. So let's talk a little bit about, three different ways that you can have a toxin problem. Number one is you can be exposed to too much of something. Like I said just a moment ago, most of us live similar lives, and we're all exposed to the same types of chemicals from the same sources, generally to the same degree. But every once in a while, someone might have a hobby or a job that exposes them to certain chemicals more than the average person. And I may have used this analogy just not too long ago, and forgive me if I repeat myself, but just in the last year or so, I've been working with a gentleman who owns like an auto body shop, and he's frequently doing some of the work himself. And so he's working with solvents and degreasers and different types of industrial paints. And lo and behold, because of his job and his exposure that most of us don't have, he has certain chemical load that I wouldn't expect from the average client who doesn't do that type of work. And so, if you are not, and here's another example, just to kind of hit the point home, is that another person I'm working with owns a construction company. And again, it's a small operation, and he does a lot of the work himself. And we find in his toxin burden assessment, we find that chemicals associated with the construction industry are higher in him than I typically find with other people. But we're all exposed to those, right? We're all exposed to plastics and insulation and all different kinds of things. So how do you actually get a toxic burden? Number one is you get exposed to a lot of something, and sometimes unique things based on your personal life and maybe your professional career. You can also have a problem with toxins because of some kind of a genetic glitch. And we haven't talked about genetic polymorphisms or single nucleotide polymorphisms, what are called SNPs. These are basically gene variants that we all have, most of which are inconsequential when it comes to the clinical perspective in your health. But sometimes people have specific gene variants that reduce the efficiency of, say, the liver enzymes that are used in phase 1 detox. And they might have methylation defects or defects in the enzymes that produce glutathione, which handle different types of toxicants and so on and so on. And so, to be honest, some people are just poor metabolizers. Some people are very good metabolizers. And sometimes you can recognize this in yourself. If you're the type of person who tends to get the side effect of any supplement or medication that you take, or if you have to take very small amounts compared to, say, what a standard dose is, because a standard dose is too much for you, then you probably have some kind of gene variant that's impacting your detoxification capacity. And that's just a whole different conversation, because it's a relatively new field of research to look at genes and how they affect our response to diet, lifestyle, and environment. But that is a very common thing. And then the final way that you can actually have a toxic problem, or a toxin, let's call it a toxin problem, is you can lose tolerance to your environment. Now, I've mentioned this concept, and it's an immunological concept. I've mentioned this concept of loss of tolerance before. And tolerance, as it relates to the immune system, has to do with your ability to not react to something. And there are a lot of people who have the same toxin burden that perhaps you and I have, and maybe we're sick with it and they're not. And the problem is our immune system is broken down and theirs hasn't. And so when you lose tolerance to the environment, you get things like chemical sensitivity. You're the person who has to get all new, personal care products with lotions and shampoos and soaps that you use. Maybe you've had to go to super clean cosmetics or change out all the household cleaners in your home because you can't be exposed to the harsh chemicals. Or maybe you're the person who smells gasoline or strong perfume, and you get a headache, or you get brain fog, or you get tired, or you get an anxiety attack. And not to say that these are the things that always come out of some type of environmental response. That's going to be unique to you as an individual, but these are the things that I commonly see with the one-on-one clients that I work with. Just give me a second to take a little sip here. But I'll tell you that when we're dealing with a toxin problem because somebody has lost tolerance to the environment, number one, that's an immunological issue. That's not necessarily the environment itself, but it's a change in how the body is responding to that. But the key thing with loss of tolerance is that it doesn't take exposure to more toxins to make you sick. All it takes is losing tolerance to what's already there. And so maybe you haven't had any unusual toxin exposure than, say, I have, or your neighbor, or your brother, your sister, your mother, your spouse, or whatever. But you've had something happen in your physiology where your immune system has broken down to the point where it now reacts to things that you've always been exposed to that are already inside your system. And again, the manifestation of that is going to be unique to you. And what I tell people in general, because if I'm going through, for example, a toxin load report with somebody, and they'll say, well, what about this chemical? What does this chemical do? And number one, it's very hard to answer that because there's not a lot of research in this area. What we can tell you is that in general, all toxins promote an inflammatory response, the degree to which is going to be partly dependent on the chemical itself, but mostly dependent on their own physiology and how sensitive or reactive they are. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the vast majority of people with a chemical load that is a problem for them are going to have an amplification of whatever their core problems are. And so if I have two people and one has migraines and joint pain and the other person has brain fog and, say, depression, if they both have a chemical load or they lose tolerance, then one person is going to have more migraines and more joint pain, and the other person is going to have more brain fog and more depression. Because all these things do, the majority of what they do is they amplify through an inflammatory response. They amplify whatever the core physiological challenge is for that particular person. So that's how we get a toxin problem, right? Exposed to too much of something, more so than average, we can have a genetic glitch and we can lose immunological tolerance. And of course, you can have a combination of all of those. And kind of like the worst thing would be someone who has they're a poor metabolizer genetically, and so they're more at risk for toxic burden because they can't clear it out properly. And they've lost tolerance for whatever reason. And now they adopt a hobby or a job where they're exposed to, in an unusual way, exposed to more of something that most of us don't get exposed to. And like I said, you can have all of those. All right, let's talk about different sources of toxins. And we'll talk about, again, the general impact of toxins, and then we'll see where we are with our timeline. So sources of toxins, number one is like industry and consumer products. So we've all seen pictures, and maybe you live in a place where there are manufacturing plants, and you see that smokestack and all the stuff being spewed up into the environment. And certainly we have governmental regulations that regulate how much of these things that companies are allowed to produce. And obviously, there are some companies which at times don't obey the rules, they don't obey the laws. But nevertheless, manufacturing industries produce a lot of these chemicals. Agriculture, particularly conventional agriculture, with their heavy use of things like pesticides and insecticides. We have on the consumer product side, we have all of your personal care products. So you really have to be smart about the choices you make in terms of what you wash your body with, or what you wash your hair with, or the lotions that you put on, or cosmetics that you use. Then we have all of your household cleaners. All of those are typically chemical laden. And here's the key is, and there are toxins that we don't think about, and the list is really long. So I'm just going to give you a couple of more. But all of your furniture, like unless you have nothing but handmade wooden furniture, by a local artisan, chances are that your couch, your brand new bed, your mattress, any drapes that you buy, like different types of textiles, even sometimes the clothing that you wear, all of these have chemicals. So much so that baby clothes right now are required by federal law to have flame retardants in the fabric. And so, that baby that you love, or maybe it's a grandchild, that you give a bath with some kind of soap that usually has some chemicals in it, generally less than what we use for as adults. And then you swaddle them up and put them in their onesie and put them to bed. That onesie that's contacting their skin, that's just been warmed up by a warm bath, is now probably leaching flame retardant chemicals into their little bodies, which we would like to think are pristine, but they're not, because we already know that babies are being born with hundreds of chemicals in them because the mother has a chemical burden and she passes that on to her child. And so whether it is manufacturing industry or the agricultural industry or the personal care products you use or the household cleaners that you use or the furniture, the textiles and the clothing, and the list goes on, you're being exposed to chemicals all the time. I'm sitting here in front of my computer. Now, computer is probably about 6 or 7 years old, and even computers give off chemicals. It's a crazy thing to think about. But yes, your iPhone or your smartphone, your tablet, your television, all of these things have chemicals that get emitted into the environment, and we breathe them in, we come into contact with them, they get inside our body. There is no doubt about that. But then on the other side, we have all the external toxins that come into our body, but then we also have byproducts of human physiology, right? All of your metabolic processes create compounds that have to be broken down and eliminated. And if you were tracking when we talked about detox and hormones, we talked a little bit about what we call phase 1 metabolites. And we'll cover that again as we go through this detox mini-series. But these phase 1 metabolites can often be more toxic than whatever parent compound you started with. And so secondary and even tertiary metabolites, as we try to break them down and get rid of them, sometimes these things are more toxic, more inflammatory, and they escape and they get back into recirculation, where they actually cause more problem than whatever it was that you started with. And so I said a moment ago that we can kind of talk about the general impact of toxins and the toxic burden. And, the first thing that comes to mind when we talk about the impact of toxin is the creation of inflammatory response. And without getting into like deep cellular physiology, there's this thing called nuclear factor kappa beta, or NF kappa B. There's a bunch of people out on the internet been talking about this for the last, year or so. People who are podcasters or clinicians like myself. And NF kappa B, basically, it's a cellular signal that tells cells to become inflamed. And so whether it's environmental toxins or stress reactions or infections or even hormonal imbalances or changes in blood sugar stability, all of these things drive inflammation by doing one thing, and that is the activation of NF kappa B. And so what NF kappa B does is it goes from what's called the cytoplasm of the cell. It goes into the nucleus and it binds to your DNA in an area that contains the instructions for inflammation. And so when NF-kappa B gets activated to a certain extent, it drives the inflammatory process. And this is systemic because these chemicals are going to be everywhere because they float around in your blood. They live in all of your extracellular spaces, and they tend to get deposited in fatty tissue, most notably in your body fat, but also, as I said earlier, in other organ systems that have a fat component, which would be things like bone marrow or perhaps even brain tissue. So activation of inflammation is one of the key things that happens. And so you and I deal with an increased inflammatory load beyond what we would normally have, just simply because we live in a toxic world and we ourselves are toxic to a certain extent. The other thing that this does, because there is an inflammatory process which brings oxidative stress, the production of free radicals, then your chemical burden tends to deplete your glutathione. And glutathione, again, been talked about on the internet now for several years. Glutathione is your major intracellular antioxidant. It's an amino acid, a blend of 3 different amino acids. So basically, it's a small peptide, if you would call it that. And this molecule called glutathione does several different things. Number one, it quenches the free radical oxidative stress that comes with your inflammatory load. And so what ends up happening, because glutathione does other things, is if your chemical load and your inflammatory oxidative stress levels go high enough, you can deplete glutathione, which is interesting because glutathione is one of the key ways that we drive the phase 2 process of liver detoxification. And so one of the things that allows us to handle the inflammatory load and protect ourselves from that is also one of the major things that we use to detoxify. And so we end up with a double whammy. We can't protect ourselves against inflammation and oxidative stress, and we get further degradation of our ability to clear out certain types of chemicals. We also know that toxins can disrupt the hormonal system. I'm not going to go into that again because we just did an episode on that not that long ago, but I will point out that most of the research in terms of endocrine or hormonal disruption by chemicals shows us that it's mostly the thyroid system and the estrogen systems that tend to take the burden or take the hit. And what that might mean is that women are particularly more susceptible to environmental toxicity and having that change their physiology than, say, a man is. Not that their thyroid system is different than ours, but certainly when we look at reproductive hormones, there's a lot more emphasis of the estrogen system in women than there is in men. Then we also see with toxins is the activation of fat cells. And this is an interesting concept because for decades, science in general thought that your fat cells were just a passive place where we stored excess energy. Not getting into the mechanisms of creating body fat and all that kind of stuff. But the bottom line is what we know now is that certain types of body fat, particularly visceral fat, the fat that is inside, say, your chest and your abdominal cavity that surrounds your organs to protect and cushion them, when they get activated, and many mechanisms can do that, including an environmental chemical load, what ends up happening is that these cells start to produce inflammation, just like other cells do, and they can secrete hormones that then change things like hunger and satiety signal. And it can affect how the hypothalamus works in terms of regulating food intake and the desire to move and exercise and how we extract calories from our diet. And so activation of fat cells, changing them from just simple energy storage depots into immunologically and hormonally active cells that can mess up your metabolism. We also know that toxins can skew your immunotype. And that's a relatively new term. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's been in the literature for a while, but it's only in the last, we're going close to a year now, but only in the last year that we have any testing to actually define with some detail that makes any difference to us how your immune system is balanced. And is it responding appropriately to some kind of a challenge, or does it have some kind of dysfunctional profile that is actually promoting part of your problem? This is called defining your immunotype. And what we find in the literature is that if somebody has, for example, a depressed natural killer cell population, or if they've skewed towards a Th1 and a Th17 dominance pattern. Maybe they've lost their CD4 cells or their CD8 dominant or something like that. These are all different types of immunotypes. When we look in the literature, environmental toxicity can cause all of these things. And here's the challenge. It would be so nice for me as a clinician, helping people like you, if I could measure your chemical load and find one chemical elevated and measure your immunotype and have one type of cell either increased or decreased so that that's all I'm dealing with. But the reality is, when I run a quantitative urinary analysis on someone's toxin load, I might find a dozen different chemicals or toxins that are elevated at the same time, each of which will have a slightly different impact on different systems, all of which will drive inflammation and deplete your glutathione, and all of which have unpredictable impacts on your immune system. And so we can't look at someone's chemical load and predict how it's going to affect their immune system. We have to look at both, which is the advantage of having high quality, very reliable and accurate testing, which we do today, which is fantastic. And then the final general impact of toxins is to break your immune tolerance. And we've just defined tolerance as the ability to not react to something. So when you lose tolerance or you break tolerance to your environment, you start reacting immunologically to your chemical load. And it's interesting that the chemicals to which people start to react are usually the ones that accumulate to a greater extent, which means you're either dealing with unusual exposure, a genetic variant in your ability to clear that particular compound, or some other things that might promote that loss of tolerance. And this brings the, not just the multiple chemical sensitivity, but it brings about the potential for what we would call a chemical-induced autoimmunity. And that's really the spectrum. So I'm looking at my time here. We're just at about 15 minutes. So I think I'm going to call it to a close here. And hopefully that was, number one, not too burdensome on you to listen to me for 50 minutes. But also eye-opening in the sense that, number one, environmental exposure to toxins is an inescapable fact of life. It's not if you are toxic, you are. How toxic are you? How bad is it? What's your chemical burden and load from a quantitative standpoint? And if you are displaying signs of loss of chemical tolerance, does it make sense for you to work with someone to do some testing to figure out whether or not you do have immunological responses? All right, guys, I'm going to leave it there. This is just the introduction to another mini-series about detoxification, 3D detox, embedded in the concept of autonomous health. And let me just close by reiterating what I said in the very beginning. In today's age, there's no reason why you shouldn't be making decisions to take care of yourself. Thankfully, I'll never be out of a job because there's always going to be somebody who has a complicated scenario that they can't figure out for themselves. But nevertheless, that shouldn't remove the obligation that, this is my body, this is my health. I'm going to be the one that makes the decisions about how I take care of it. I might need someone else's input and counsel, but I am responsible for the quality of life that I have. So let's look at building your autonomy. Let's look at building up your knowledge base and help you understand that there's so much that you can do with diet, lifestyle, supplementation, exercise, sleep, and modifying your environmental exposure and responses that can help promote health and well-being. All right, this is Dr. Noseworthy signing off another episode of the Inflammation Nation. We'll see you on the next slide. Thank you so much for listening to the Inflammation Nation. If you found this episode valuable, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so that you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. And why not head over to my main website, drnoseworthy.com, that's drnoseworthy.com, to explore my personalized functional medicine coaching programs, submit a question to the podcast, maybe take a quiz, or even reach out to me using the contact form that you can find there. We'll see you next time.